Bom, boa noite, pessoal. Nós estamos em live aqui com o Steven Fluin, do Google. So, yeah, here, live. And Steven Fluin is going to start a talk with us. I'm going to talk a little bit in Portuguese. So, pessoal, a gente vai ser em inglês, a palestra. Eu sei que nem todo mundo, às vezes, consegue falar. A gente pretende fazer uma força-tarefa depois para ter legenda, mas no final vai ter uma sessão de perguntas. Vocês podem perguntar, quem não se sentir confortável falar em inglês, pode perguntar em português, a gente traduz para ele em inglês. So I was just saying that we are gonna do it in English, and after it, we are gonna try to do some subtitles to the live, to the video that's gonna be recorded, and they can ask in Portuguese that we can translate on the QA session after it. So
first of all, please, guys, por favor, gente, uma salva de palmas. Thank you so much for us.
So you can start.
Awesome. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. Yes. Let me go ahead and share my screen then. Make sure the presentation comes up okay. You can see everything?
Yes.
Awesome. So I'll start off by saying bom dia. My name is Peter. So I haven't been to Brazil in like 4 years, but I spent about 3 weeks in Sao Paulo and I spent 2 weeks in Rio. This was a picture of me at a company in Sao Paulo called Mettler Toledo. I don't know if people know that company, but I did that as part of my MBA study abroad. So trying to meet with really cool companies that were doing awesome things in Brazil. So I really wish I could be there with you in person, but a remote presentation will have to be the next best thing. You guys will all have to go out into the city and have fun, hit up all the nightclubs, which is one of the things I did while I was there. So I'm a developer advocate on the Angular team, so I lead developer relations for us. And my job at Google really has two parts. The first is to help developers be successful with Angular. And the second is to understand what it's like being a developer in the real world so that we can reflect those needs onto our team so that we're making the right sort of product decisions. On a day-to-day basis, this ends up meaning a lot of different things. So I speak at a bunch of conferences. I work with a lot of large enterprises that are using Angular at scale. And I manage something called our GDE program, or Google Developer Experts program, where we try and certify a bunch of people kind of across the globe who are having an impact in the community and who are experts in Angular. And I'm happy to say, I think we have 2 or 3 different Google Developer Experts in Brazil. I know, I think Loiana is a big deal there. She does a lot of great content in Brazilian Portuguese. So a huge shout out to her. And then we actually just added a new GD who I think is at this meetup.
No, she is not here, but she was here like 5 times already.
Oh, okay.
And right now we have me here, William, and Kayla, that are both the Google Developer Expert as well.
Yes, awesome. So everything that they say, not everything, but most things they say have been actually certified by Google. So they definitely know what they're talking about. They're definitely experts in the field. So you guys are really lucky to have such great people in your community. So before I give any talk on Angular, I think it's really important that everyone kind of understands why the Angular team is doing what we do and how we perceive the universe. And so we break that down traditionally into our 3 values. So the first value is apps that users love to use. I often jump up and down trying to explain this to people because sometimes developers tend to forget this. Every line of code that you write is at the end of the day trying to benefit a user. Even if you're building the craziest backend system in the world where it's an ETL and it's doing some data processing 8 levels deep in a database, you're still doing that to create value for a user. And I think that's really important to acknowledge because at the end of the day, if we're not serving our users, then we're not doing a job as software developers. So we do care that Angular actually makes it easy to build apps that users love. But second, we do care about developer experience. Obviously, we spend a lot of time making Angular very well integrated, very opinionated, very kind of good for building things at scale. So we care about apps that developers love to build. And lastly, and probably one of the biggest reasons for our success is that we focus on building a community where everyone feels welcome. You can see this in our presentation and meetups. We can see this in the GDE program. We work really, really hard to reward and engage the community because most of what is being done with Angular is not actually being done by us, right? It's an ecosystem of people that are training and giving tutorials and doing consulting and building tools. And we are really, really fortunate to have that awesome community kind of come with us on this journey. So we're here today to talk about performance in Angular applications. And I'm specifically, for the most part of this talk, going to be talking about bootstrapping the performance of your application or startup time of your application, because that's where we see most of the user impact. There's a lot of kind of more advanced strategies that you can use for runtime performance, like minimizing the amount of change injection, getting out of zones, those sorts of things. There's some good content out there, but today specifically, I want to talk about the kind of higher order magnitude impact that you can have by focusing on how your application is loaded by the browser, focusing on how your application starts up. And so I'll go through this in a few different sections. So I'll talk through some tactical fixes that you should apply in your application or look out for. I want to talk about how to think about architecting your Angular application at scale. And then I want you to understand a little bit about JavaScript serving, because more and more we're seeing that applications need to be served well, even though they're fully client-side applications. And then I'll give everyone a sneak peek at some of the things that are going on that we're thinking about for the future. So let's dive in on the tactical fixes side of things. I hope everyone here believes that performance matters. I can't see your hands, but raise your hand if you don't think performance matters. Okay, now everyone else point to that person and shame them.
Levanta a mão quem acha que performance não importa.
Nobody sent us his hand.
Okay, good. Very, very good. Nice job, everyone. So the first thing that I would say is really pay attention to what matters. So if you think back to that value that we started with, which is an apps that users love to use, we need to look for the biggest thing that affects the user experience. And what we find very, very often is that the bundle size is the highest order of magnitude thing that affects a user's experience. So what this is actually a tree map that's breaking down what's in the JavaScript that we send down to the client. And so you can see that there's 503 KB in this application, broken up into a few bits of Angular, a few bits of third-party dependencies, and so on. So we talk a lot about bundle size because it really is the #1 factor in startup performance and time to interactive. This is a really important thing because a lot of people think it's just network, where you're waiting for maybe a slow 2G connection, or you're doing budgeting of maybe a user's internet connectivity. But there's also a secondary cost, which is oftentimes very, very large as well, which is that of parse time. So when your browser downloads the JavaScript for an Angular application, it's not just waiting for the network. As soon as that JavaScript gets loaded, it has to actually parse through it all. And especially on CPU-limited devices, this can take some significant time. We did some benchmarking last year, and one of the things that we saw was that the parse time was such a big deal that for some types of applications, if you used a service worker and you had a local serving of a large JavaScript application, that could still be slower than a server-side rendered application. So even though you didn't have to hit the network at all, the parse time of your browser to load that application was longer than the time to go to the network, request for a set of HTML, and receive that back and render it to the screen. So there's some things there that you should definitely be aware of. And one of the biggest problems that happens for us developers is that we oftentimes don't notice our bundle size while developing, because oftentimes we're in developer mode, we're on these hardwired connections, we're accessing our files via localhost. And so bundle size almost doesn't affect us because we often have these high power machines too. And so we really like to draw developers' attention to this idea of bundle size. One of the really interesting statistics, I don't know the statistics for Brazil, but at least in the US, 70% of web traffic comes from mobile devices. And the only other country I know the statistic for is in China. It's over 90%. And so a lot of people think about their users as being sitting at a desktop or a laptop computer with kind of unlimited network, unlimited computing power. But this is really not the case, right? We see anytime a user can consume an application on mobile, they want to do that. And this is actually one of the big interesting things that we see companies doing all the time, is that they look at their Google Analytics traffic and they say, hey, nobody uses our application on mobile, so we don't need to optimize it for mobile. We don't need to care about bundle size or performance. But what I would point back at them is that they're really creating their own analytics. They're missing the opportunity, where if you spent more time focusing on performance and bundle size, you would actually probably drive more mobile adoption. So you're actually missing out on that piece of things. One of the features that we introduced in the CLI is the idea of bundle budgets. We actually added this by default now. So what you'll see is in the configurations for your build target, like production, there's now a budgets key that you can add in. And there's a bunch of different budgets that you can provide. You can provide initial budgets. You can have one for all of the JavaScript. You can have any individual chunk being measured. And the idea here is that we can build systems in place to either warn or break the application build when you exceed those budgets. Google is really big on this idea of automating a lot of these processes, because when you rely on humans to be watching these things in an ad hoc manner, oftentimes they mess up. Oftentimes they aren't paying attention at the right time, just because we all get sucked into the short term and the medium term of how do I ship the application? How do I get that new feature out that I'm trying to ship? And it can be very hard to keep the attention on some of the broader things that definitely matter across the board. Another very tactical thing that you should be doing is staying up to date. So the latest major of Angular is 7.0. If you look back over the last few versions, in every release, we've done things to improve the performance of Angular. So for example, between versions 2 and 4, we reduced bundle sizes of generated code by about 60%, which is huge. And every release that we do has some focus on performance and making your application smaller and better. And this is something that we continue to do with every release. We also are spending a lot of time and energy on making sure that every release is even easier than the last one to adopt. So the changes from 2 to 4 were bigger than the changes from 4 to 5, 5 to 6, 6 to 7. Like what we're hearing now from most developers is that the latest major, so updating to version 7, took them less than an hour. And that is actually a really big deal to us, because a lot of people write content like, oh, what's new in Angular 7? How do I do an HTTP call in Angular 7? We want the number to disappear. We want to kind of create a world where we're going to release every 6 months and it's going to be okay, because we're focusing on making sure that your application keeps working, and anything that we do need to change, we're going to automatically transition for you. This is actually one of the big investments that we've been making over the last couple of years, is trying to flip and invert the relationship between you and your dependencies, where historically you would build an application, update your dependencies, and then you kind of see where it broke. Whereas we want your dependencies to be responsible for updating you whenever they have to make changes. And so definitely stay up to date, because that's how you're going to get the best performance characteristics. And we're seeing most developers doing this at this point. As of the last few major releases, the majority of applications were already on the latest major. So this is something we're really, really happy with. So I want to tell you a brief story. So as I mentioned in the beginning, one of the things that I do is I work with companies that are building with Angular applications. And the worst, most egregious use case I've ever seen was a 15 megabyte main bundle. And so this was really bad from a number of reasons. It meant that their build was taking a few minutes to run, and it was taking their application a really, really long time to load. And they said, what are you doing? What's going on here? And what we found out was that they were doing a bunch of really weird things. So for example, they were embedding SVGs inside of their CSS, inside of their templates in their Angular application. And so what this ended up actually meaning for them was that their SVGs were being rendered as JavaScript. And so instead of being able to take advantage of all of the browser's optimizations for SVGs and images and streaming and all those things, users were having to pay the JavaScript parse time cost to render template scoped SVGs. And that's definitely not what they wanted. So this was like a really, really easy fix for them. But they wouldn't have known that without actually going in and looking at their bundles. And that's how we figured out that problem. That's how we solved it. Another tactical thing that I want everyone to think about is being careful what you import. We've done a lot of work in RxJS, because the creator of RxJS actually joined the Angular team. And so we're trying to align as much as possible on how to use RxJS in the best way possible, and to get rid of what we call foot guns, or ways that developers can shoot themselves in the foot. And one of the things that we did was we actually removed a lot of the entry points for RxJS. It used to be that you could just import from single quote RxJS, and you would get the entirety of RxJS. And we were really working hard to try and get rid of that, so that you actually import more finally. You say, okay, import this operator, that operator, the other operator, and then you use those only as you need, because then the build tooling like Webpack and the Angular CLI can be intelligent enough to leave out the rest of RxJS that you're not using. And so this is goes back to the idea of staying up to date. That's a really big, important idea. Another of the places where you want to be careful where you import, where we're trying to make this better over time, is material, and especially the theming. So I would recommend that you definitely, if you're worrying about performance and using a lot of material, think about which of the modules you're importing and why, and whether you need them. And then one of the things to note is if you use the kind of default out-of-the-box CSS themes, the pre-built themes, you're actually going to get all of the themes for all of Angular material. So our intent and our hope is for anyone that needs the kind of higher tiers of performance, you actually go through the theme that we've generated for you or your custom theme, and you remove the components you're not using. We've designed that theme CSS in a way that you should be able to go through it and kind of pull out the parts you're not using. The other one I see a lot is third-party SDKs. If you import Lodash wrong, if you import Moment wrong, you end up getting a lot more than you want. I saw an application the other day. They were doing a bake-off between Angular and another framework, and they're like, oh, look, the Angular application is so much bigger. And what they found is that they were including 3 copies of all of the locales from Moment. And so by just changing how they imported Moment, they were immediately able to solve that and make the Angular application much, much faster. So you've got bundle budgets now, but that's only really being applied by developers. And so even though it will fail a build, one of the things that we recommend is consider adding a bundle size check to your CI or to your integration system. So the way you would typically do this is actually have a save kind of rendered out memory spot in your CI where you save the size of every build. And anytime that build increases in size, that should probably throw a warning. That should probably start a conversation, because oftentimes we as developers, we accidentally increase the size of our applications, right? Hey, I want to use this cool new tool. And we don't necessarily realize the size of the impact that it's going to have on our users. So I want to just do a really quick demo here where we take a look at the actual CLI and I show you how to do some of these things around source maps and understanding what goes into our Angular application. So I'm going to jump to our CLI here. So what I've got here is a just ng-nude Angular application. If I look in VS Code, this should look very, very familiar to everyone. You've got a source folder, you've got an app folder, you've got the kind of default app HTML. And so what we're going to do is, instead of actually modifying into this code, let's just do a build. So I'm going to do ng build -- prod, everyone can see here. And I'm going to add in an extra flag here. So this extra flag is going to be --source map. And what this source map flag will do is it will give me the production build with all of the AOT, all of the minification, all the build optimization, but it will also generate source maps for all of the files that I'm using. At the same time, what I want to do over here is I'm going to actually use something called, or I'll use something called Source Map Explorer. So I'll just globally add this. Much, much bigger. So I'm going to say yarn global add Source Map Explorer. There's a few of these different tools out there, so feel free to use whatever tool you like best, but I'm a big fan of Source Map Explorer. So we're going to install Source Map Explorer, and what we're going to do is we're going to give Source Map Explorer the .map files that came from this build. So if you're not familiar, you can find all of your JavaScript files in your dist folder. If we look here, we're going to see we've got a main.js file, we've got polyfills, we've got runtime, etc. And so most of our application is in our main.js. What we can do is we can give Source Map Explorer our main.js file. And what it will do is it will actually analyze the original source to figure out where is all the bundle size coming from. So in this application, we can see we've got 102 KB coming from core, we've got 70K from the router, we've got 29 KB from ArcGIS. So this is a case where, for example, if this was a really simple application, maybe where I didn't need the router, I could get rid of that and cut out 30% of my bundle size. And that really, really does have a 30% effect on the actual performance of an application or load time of the application. So this is really, really important to understand. The other thing that I want to point everyone at here is in your Angular JSON. So this is where we configure your projects. This is where you configure your workspace, so to say. And one of the things that we did is we put in this budgets by default. So every application comes with a 2 meg and a 5 meg budget. The reason we picked these numbers is that this is where Chrome actually starts to send warnings to users in mobile devices. So if you're using a smartphone from Android and you're using Chrome and you have the speed, I think it's like speed saver mode on, where a lot of the content's going to be proxied to make it faster or minified to make it faster, Chrome will actually warn you if your browser tries loading more than 5 megabytes of JavaScript. And it will say, hey, user, you're loading a lot of JavaScript. You may not want to do this. Do you want to stop? And so we've tried to mirror the warnings that are going to affect the user experience here in our CLI. And so you should actually, if you take a look at this in context, you can see here's all the different types of budgets, right? So you can measure every file we output, all the scripts we output, any individual file, any script, the full bundle, or your initial. Typically, with a lot of our more advanced strategies, we measure initial, because once the user has an interactive screen, once they have an interactive application, the other things that they're doing, we can lazy load, and they matter less because they don't block the critical path. So with just those two kind of strategies, that gives a lot of developers a good understanding of what's going into their bundles and how they can improve performance of their app. So the next topic that I want to talk a little bit about is the idea of architecting our applications for scale. So this really comes down to the idea of splitting our application into an architecture or a set of modules that are going to be loaded in the right order and in the right way. So what we end up doing here is we use our router to actually create these code split boundaries. So anytime you refer from your router to a path instead of synchronously with like a component, but you say load children, what you're going to get is instead it's going to automatically split out your application into a single bundle for every lazy loaded module. So we got both the code splitting and the lazy loading kind of automatically set up for you. And what happens here is as the user navigates to a route, it will actually load the appropriate module, and then it will never need to load that again. This strategy actually informed, there's a brand new lazy component loading tool that one of our GDEs released. His name was Aaron Frost. He released a library called Lazy AF. So his name is Aaron Frost. So maybe that's where the AF came from. I'm not sure. But it uses the exact same strategy of our router at a component level. So if we take a look at the source code in the router, you can see we're saying load children here, and then referring asynchronously to a string that's going to be resolved by the compiler instead of being resolved as a symbol and built into the same bundle. So when you're thinking about lazy loading and you're architecting your application, you might think, okay, what should I be lazy loading? So one of the most common places that we see is lazy loading your admin routes. So if you have like an edit interface, oftentimes you need to load more forms, you need to load more tools, maybe like markdown renderers, all those sorts of things. And that's all code that you don't want to make your kind of default users pay for. We also, as I said, editor interfaces. We also say recommend your homepage route. And this seems a little bit counterintuitive, right? Because most of my users are going to need my homepage route. But even if the default route of your application is lazy loaded, it won't actually increase the time at all, because what you're doing is you're taking that homepage out of the critical path so that it's still in the ultimate critical path, but the browser can start parsing the Angular piece of your application and the main JS while your homepage is downloading in the background. So definitely think about lazy loading even initial routes for users. So at some point, when you think about the module hierarchy of your application, you should effectively be thinking about your application as kind of every piece of it being lazy loaded based on need. So anytime you can create another boundary and code split more finely, this almost always increases performance. Another tip that I have would be maximizing the amount of code run. So this is the same kind of general concept of lazy loading, but a different way of looking at it. And so if we were 100% successful at code splitting and lazy loading, you would only download code that you know 100% certain is going to be run. Now, you're never going to get there perfectly, but one of the things you can do is you can actually, in DevTools, if you click on the little 3 dots on the left, you can click on coverage, and you can measure how much of your JavaScript is being run. Because if you're pulling in a lot of JavaScript or dependencies that aren't needed, this is going to show up as low coverage being run by the browser when the user loads your application. And this is one of those smells that you can use to say, hey, maybe I need to do something a little bit different in my app. So the next section that is something that I'm really passionate about, and this is one of my big missions in 2019, is we've got a lot of web developers out there that are really good at building JavaScript applications. But then they often hand off their code to a DevOps team or to a backend team to serve that application, or they serve it in kind of some naive way. And we see that this ends up causing problems for users. So the first thing I'd recommend developers take a look at is the idea of content compression. Now, most of us probably already know what this is, but for anyone that doesn't, this is a server feature that's supported in Apache, Nginx, IIS, really anything you're using supports this, where it takes your application. So let's say you had 900 KB of JavaScript, and will shrink that by a compression virtually seamlessly, where the browser will uncompress it. Now, this is probably kind of a repeat for a lot of developers in the room, but the reason I hammer on this one so hard is that in production applications, so these are production like applications that are built in Angular on the web, we see that about 40% of them don't use content compression. And that number just still blows me away, because you're effectively almost more than tripling the amount of weight that you're creating for your users, because they have to download more, they have to parse more. So 40%. So this was from a scan I did of about 900 Angular sites, and that number just blows me away. Another very advanced strategy is using HTTP2. So HTTP2 is a successor to HTTP 1.1. Hopefully you don't have to get too much into this, but under the hood, what's happening is in HTTP 1, every time your browser tries to load another file from the web, whether that's main.js, whether that's index.html, whether that's an image, it makes a new HTTP or a TCP connection for those requests. Whereas HTTP2 is much, much smarter, and it pipelines all those requests. So it reduces the kind of negotiation overhead of every one of those requests to a single time. And then it also, because it's pipelined, it can actually send down multiple files. So it saves on overhead. There's less networking. There's no additional DNS lookups. You have a whole bunch of different benefits from this. And so if you're looking in the dev tools, you'll see this again in the protocol column. You might have to right click to add that column. But if you see H2, that is HTTP2. One of the things that HTTP2 enables is the concept of server push, which I really like to think of this idea of letting the browser and the server work together. So HTTP2 server push allows you to say, when a user requests my index.html file, I know already what additional files they're going to need. So historically, what would happen is the browser would request an index.html file, then it had to wait for it to download, and then it would parse it. And then it would say, I need these additional files, and then start downloading the additional files. But with server push configuration and HTTP2, what you can do is you can actually say, hey, I just received on the server, I received an index.html request. I know that they'll need my main.js file and my runtime.js and my polyfills. So let's just send those down immediately. And so this is a big win for developers. And out of like a 10-second load time from some of the tests I've done, this cuts around 3 seconds off on a slow 3G low-powered Android device. And so this can be a very, very big deal as well. So there's two concepts to really understand what's going on here. So you've got throughput, just how much you can send in a given time frame, and latency, how long any individual piece takes to get there. So when you don't have server push, again, we load the first thing, index.html, that tells us about 2 more things, and then we have a full round trip to go get the additional files. And what HTTP2 server push does is it says, let me send down all of the files they need to actually render this application without any extra round trips. If you're using Firebase, this is really easy. You can just throw this in your firebase.json for the hosting configuration. So you just set up the headers to say when someone requests index.html, then I'm going to send down the main.js. I'm going to send down whatever other files that user might need. The next strategy I want to talk about is differential serving and differential loading. So I'm trying to push for differentiating these terms because everyone has called all these strategies differential serving for a long time, but they're subtly different. But the general idea is that oftentimes, depending on the browser, depending on the user, you need to send down different content to them. The most kind of prevalent example I see of this is if you build an application, you need a lot of backward compatibility, so you include a lot of polyfills. You shouldn't be sending those polyfills to your Firefox users. And if we think about kind of JavaScript today, all of the modern browsers support ES6. So hopefully we're not having to send ES5 down to our users. By default in Angular, we're always going to send down ES5 today because that's what search engines need, that's what older browsers need. But we're trying to adopt some more advanced, more modern strategies for loading. And so I'll talk about one strategy. So this is actually live in our CLI. I think it was in actually 7.3, not in 7.2. We're already doing this for polyfills, where we will render out 2 versions of your polyfills as part of the build step. And what you'll get there is you'll get a ES5 version of your polyfills and an ES6 version of your polyfills. And then what we do is we use our knowledge of browsers that support ES6, and then we use an attribute tag on our script tags to conditionally load either the new one for browsers that support modern JavaScript or the old one for browsers that don't support modern JavaScript. So this is something that already exists for polyfills, and we are working on for version 8 to bring this into your main.js so that basically all of your JavaScript is going to be built twice, and then only the legacy JavaScript will be served to browsers that need legacy JavaScript, and all of your other users can benefit from modern JavaScript. So we have a lot of really cool tools as part of Angular. It's one of kind of the strongest parts of us that we have this integrated set of tools. But there's a few of them that are a little bit heavier. So depending on what you need, you should always think about whether you should need to bring in a Angular library, whether you actually need it. So don't bring in animations if you don't care about animations. Don't bring in forms if you don't care about forms, that sort of thing. The other side of this is that we have something called Angular Universal, which can help as well. So Angular Universal is our ability to render your Angular app on the server, which will basically do two things. This will improve the perceived load time because it will improve the time to paint because we'll send down static HTML. And then that also gives you more machine crawlable HTML because a lot of the crawlers out there like Twitter Preview don't know how to run JavaScript. And so by pre-rendering that Angular application and all the state down to HTML, that can help them render a preview and do those sorts of things. But there's a subtle problem here, which is that if we pre-render all of the HTML and then send it down and then bootstrap all the client-side Angular on top of that, while that might improve the perceived performance and the time to first paint, it might actually reduce the time to interactive because you're bootstrapping the application twice. And then there's a side effect. If you have lots of ads, for example, we're going to be swapping out the server-side rendered versions of components for client-rendered components. And so this can create double impressions. And the last problem that I want to talk about is that nothing is really interactive until everything on the page is interactive. So we're working really hard on fixing this. There's a couple of things that you can do right now. One is if you can pre-render your site, you can cache all the generated pages so that you don't have to re-render those pages on the fly. Another option would be only serve universal rendered content to machines, right? Don't give users this server-side rendered page if they don't need it. But we're working a lot on this, and this is one of our biggest areas of investment right now, is because we've got some more advanced strategies. So this more advanced strategy is to have a static first experience where we only enrich the parts of the page that we need to with something like Angular elements. And then on the first navigation, we swap out the server-side rendered version for a client-side render because then we know that we're not going to have double impressions because we're actually doing a navigation event. And we can do that navigation event entirely client-side if the JavaScript's loaded, or we can do it server-side if it hasn't. So on Google Shopping Express, which is a delivery service here in the US, I don't know if it's in Brazil, but we actually do this now. So this is the first site that we're trialing this on. But this is something that we're investing a lot in, and we want to make this much, much better in the future. So I'm going to talk about a few things that we're working on right now. So everyone probably has heard about Ivy. We've been talking about it for over a year now. If you don't know, Ivy is really just an inversion of our rendering pipeline. Right now, we've got kind of an Angular renderer, which has all the features of Angular, and that pulls in your code, which means that we basically ship all of Angular with your application, no matter how much of Angular you're using. And Ivy is going to be inverting that. So instead of taking your code and running it through runtime, it turns all of your code into Ivy instructions that pull in Angular only as needed. And so combined with tree shaking, this can make small Angular applications much, much faster. And if you do things like code splitting, or you have your application split in a bunch of modules, this can dramatically benefit you there too, because if I use one feature of Angular in one module and another feature in another module, only the ones that you need at any given time can be loaded. And so we have this really lofty number of a 3 KB Hello World application. Obviously, we don't expect real developers to get down to 3K unless you're not using any of Angular. But this was really a big milestone for us because it meant that we could render an application very, very small. Where we are on the roadmap, we actually just did a big blog post last week about what's coming up in version 8 and when Ivy is going to land. So right now we are doing some of the finishing touches on the Ivy runtime. But what's going to happen is in version 8, we are going to offer Ivy as an opt-in preview. So anyone that wants to take their application or take a new application and flip it over to Ivy will be able to do that. And then you can tell us what's broken. And then the plan is that in the next major After that, we will just flip it on for everybody because we will be very confident in the backward compatibility. Another thing that we're working on right now is ng-deploy. So we're trying to make it so that you can run a single command and get kind of opinionated serving infrastructure. So all those best practices I talked about, like compression and HTTP2 serving, we want to configure those for you. So we're kind of broadening our scope from just the JavaScript side of the world into the full stack. How do we serve and render our application on the server as well? And then Angular Universal, I mentioned that we're investing a lot in this because there's a lot of advanced use cases. Imagine if we could lazy load more things. So one of the really cool demos that we have out there right now is lazy loading per component. And so we have a lot of cool ideas, like what if you could use NGRX to create resumable applications where we don't send anything down except the statically rendered HTML, and then the application resumes using kind of a transferred NGRX store type idea. So we've got lots of really cool ideas there, even, for example, lazy loading your reducers for your NGRX store, but where we're still experimenting. One of the very cool areas where we're experimenting right now is in Vikram's project Ivy Universal, where we're doing that component level code splitting, server-side rendering, and shallow component level hydration. So if you're curious about the state of the art that is still very, very rough and not ready for production, take a look at this repo. So the kind of general summary is that we are working a lot on performance. We care about this a lot, but we want to do it in a way that is really seamless for developers. We want you to keep writing the same Angular apps that you're writing today, and we're going to keep doing everything we can on the tooling side and the infrastructure and the framework side to keep making your applications better and to take them further. Obrigado.
Hello. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
So, thank you very much for your time with us. We are very happy that you could contribute with us and participate. It's very good to see someone that's working on the Angular to contribute and talk a little bit with us. So, pessoal, se vocês quiserem fazer perguntas agora para ele, vocês não precisam necessariamente fazer em inglês, se vocês não se sentirem confortáveis, podem fazer em português e a gente traduz. Alguém quer fazer uma pergunta? Cada vez.
And I'm going to take a quick picture of the crowd for everybody. So smile.
Okay, smile, guys.
Woo. Thank you. Oh, you want to be in the crowd? Or is there a question?
I thought that they all would like to do a question.
It was great. They were all great questions.
Alguém fazer uma pergunta, pessoal?
Thanks for the talk. Fala em português. Com relação ao compilador Eve, existe algum tipo de cuidado que nós temos que ter, principalmente com a questão de HTTP, de request, no compilador Eve, alguma coisa que a gente precisa estar um pouco, só seguir as boas práticas de lazy load, de módulo já é suficiente, ou tem alguma coisa que a gente precisaria tomar cuidado? Algum pulo do gato, algum cuidado que a gente tem para estar preparado com o Eve? Porque eu queria adotar o Eve desde a beta, mas olha, se você faz desse jeito, toma cuidado.
I did not understand that. I'm sorry.
But did you understand something about Eve, right?
I heard Evie, yes.
Yeah.
Of course. So he asked if he needs to do something to be prepared to use Eve.
No, so with Ivy, what's going to happen, the rollout is effectively going to be, it's going to be opt-in, and some things are going to be broken in 8. And then we will automatically turn it on for everyone in 9. And the reason that we're relatively confident we can do this is that how software development works at Google is that we only have one version of Angular across all of Google. And so for us to land a change to Angular, we actually have to go fix everyone's applications. So if we break every application at Google, we are the ones that have to go fix that. And we do not have time to go fix over 1,000 projects at Google that use Angular. And so the only way for us to deploy breaking changes anymore, and this is really good for you, is to build automatic tools and really great backward compatibility. So I'm not saying, I'm not guaranteeing nothing will break, but you would have to be using a really, really weird edge case, like the relying on local state generated by lifecycle events via query selectors in some way that like is not part of the API in order to be broken as part of this change. That's one that we're actually going to fix.
So it's very good to hear you saying that about all the 100, 600 applications on Google that runs all their set test suites every time you launch a new version of Master. Because
I think I said 600 in the past. It's over 1,000 now. So
yeah, I'm not updated. But every time when I say that, some folks just doesn't not believe on me. So it's very good to hear it from you on live.
Yeah, no, this is a really big deal. And this is why we're actually really confident of every commit to master. So we only release infrequently, like once every week for a patch and once every 6 months for a major. But every single commit is what Google is using. So if you visit Google Shopping Express, if you visit Google Cloud Platform, you're going to see 0.0.0 placeholder if you look at the version in the actual rendered DOM. And that's because they're using the latest commit from master.
Okay, so yeah.
Só para quem entendeu o que ele acabou de falar, eles têm mais de 1000 aplicações internas e externas dentro do Google que usam o Angular e eles usam a última versão está na master. Então, toda vez que vem uma versão da master, mesmo que ainda não tenha gerado uma última versão, eles rodam todas as testes de integração de todas as 1000 aplicações que eles têm dentro e fora do Google, e assim que passar, já vai para deploy, e todas as aplicações deles rodam essa última versão. Então, é algo bem interessante. Não é só suite teste do próprio Angular, mas de todas mais de 1000 aplicações deles.
E sobre o Ives, especificamente, ele falou que só se você estiver usando alguma coisa muito específica, como selectors no seu componente, etc. e tal, que talvez quebre, mas eles estão fazendo o possível.
Que seja retrocompatível.
Exato.
So, any other question? Se ninguém mais tiver uma outra pergunta, nosso amigo vai fazer.
Seria legal ver o tempo que acaba isso, né? Tipo, a duração disso, né? Todo esse teste de integração e tudo mais. Qual o período que essas mil aplicações aí, Matheus?
Matheus here is asking if you have any idea how much time it takes to run all the test integrations every time some new commit goes to Angular Master.
So we use Bazel. Like that it was built at Google. It's how we scale and test all of our mono repository. We've actually open sourced it, and so we're trying to get it into the CLI. We're trying to get other people to see if it can add value to them. So we have this really, really intelligent dependency graph. So when you build an Angular application, as needed, Angular will be rebuilt, Node will be rebuilt, the Linux kernel will be rebuilt, GCC will be rebuilt. So we actually compile everything from source from the ground up. But because we use Bazel, we have really, really intelligent caching layers. So nothing that hasn't been touched will be rebuilt. So a full rebuild of an Angular of Angular, which affects the 1,000+ applications and millions, I don't know if it's millions, hundreds of thousands of tests. It takes about half an hour because we use we basically triggers a whole data center to start builds of all the applications. And then maybe we have like a fast version that we can do if you want to just do a quick check, and then we have like a full version that runs on every change that gets into the repo.
Stephen, are you guys migrating to the new Angular version, like applications like Google Analytics or Google AdWords, Google AdSense as well?
So Analytics is transitioning to Angular. Google Cloud Platform, both Analytics and Google Cloud Platform are partway into their transition. So same with Firebase Console, same with a bunch of other public products. AdWords, I'm not as familiar with because they use Angular Dart, which is a fork of Angular focused on Dart.
Another question?
Você acha que o Component é uma boa ferramenta para analisar o seu bundle e contar toda a sua aplicação?
Leonardo is asking if CompuDoc, you know CompuDoc? I don't know if my pronunciation is good.
I'm not quite hearing the word Google Docs.
No, CompuDoc. It's a open source tool to documentation.
I might not be hearing it right, but I may, or I'm not familiar.
YoMP Doc. CompuDoc.
Oh, CompoDoc from Wasim. Yes.
Yeah. He is asking if it can be used as well to analyze the bundle size, or if it's a good tool for documentation and everything.
It is a good tool for documentation sites if you want your documentation site to look like what CompoDoc wants. We are talking to Wasim, like he works, he volunteers to help the Angular team all the time. So I was in a call with him earlier this morning. CompoDoc is a tool. I don't think it focuses at all on analyzing your bundles. It's really just documentation side of things. But we have some really cool ideas. We want to get to a state where like you ng a new application and you automatically get CI, deployment, documentation, all these sorts of things. That's a much longer term thing, but I see CompoDoc being a part of that. We've talked about this prototyping tool that we have at Google that we're hoping to open source at some point in the future, called CoDesign, and we actually collaborated between CompoDoc and CoDesign so they could share metadata. So the idea would be if you add metadata to your components for CompoDoc, that will also act as hints in the kind of prototyping, the drag and drop tools that you could take advantage of. So we're fans of CompoDoc.
Yeah. So probably CompoDoc is going to be the default tool for documentation in Angular CLI.
Maybe. So we're headed that direction, but like none of our sites actually use it because we don't feel like it fully meets our needs yet. But we also have complex needs.
Just going to do a little translate here. Ele falou que o CompoDoc ele não desconhece que haja alguma coisa a ver com bundle, CompoDoc para análise de bundle, mas ele é uma ótima ferramenta para documentação, das mais usadas aí pela comunidade, e é bem provável que ela acabe entrando na própria CLI como uma ferramenta de fundo de documentação quando você cria um projeto novo com CLI. Mas isso é uma coisa para o futuro, nada fechado ainda, mas ele recomenda o uso para gerar documentação. Any other question, guys?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, so I hope it's a good question.
O Angular já tem suporte a diversos preprocessadores no CSS e no HTML. Será que vai fazer algum suporte para algum tipo de engine como Java ou quanto?
So Lucas is asking that he knows that for CSS preprocessor we have a lot of options, the phone, the CLI, but he asking about preprocessor for HTML, like Pug and some others.
So you're asking, do we have other CSS processors, or are you expressing that you wish you had other CSS or HTML preprocessors?
Yes, he would like to have some processors for HTML, like Pug. Do you know the latest Jade?
I do not know that one.
Yeah, but it's like a different way to write HTML and generate the real HTML.
So what I would recommend is, for things like that, definitely go on the Angular repository on GitHub and submit a feature request, because without, I haven't heard that one before, and so it's never, maybe the team has thought about that and considered it, but I've not heard of that once before, so we didn't know that was a need. It's HTML preprocessors aren't the best fit for what we do, just because we actually compile your HTML into JavaScript instructions. So like we know how to render a component initial state, and then we have a separate rendering for updates. And we can be very targeted based on what changed and how that affects the DOM. So we can be very, very performant. So I don't know what you're trying to achieve from the HTML preprocessor, but that might interfere. But definitely propose it on the Angular repo. We welcome everyone to share what their needs are and ideas. Or send a PR if you can build it.
Ele está falando que não tem essa opção ainda. Você poderia, de repente, submeter a ideia para abrir uma issue para dar a ideia, ou até se você souber como fazer, submeter um código mesmo, abrir um PR. Mas ele falou que isso parece pouco provável, porque eles compilam realmente o HTML com um template, né? E daí isso acaba dificultando um pouco as coisas, né? Daí talvez tenha que fazer isso em 2 fases ou alguma coisa do tipo. So do we have time for one last question?
All right, if you make it fast.
Yeah. So you just said about the prototype tool that you guys are doing in Google. And I really would like to have that. We have a lot of folks here that really would like a prototype tool using real Angular components. Do you have any idea when it's maybe gonna be public, at least in a beta version that you can test?
We are pushing that team on that all of the time. And I don't want to brag, but it actually it's turned from an idea into something that actually works. So I'm personally very excited about it. I don't know. So like they have to prove that it works for our teams first before they're allowed to open source it.
Yeah. Cool. Só falando que ele falou uma ferramenta de prototipação usando componentes reais de Angular, então você pode usar seus componentes de Angular para uma ferramenta de prototipação, e eles estão trabalhando duro para que isso lance o quanto antes, mas eles não têm uma data ainda, infelizmente. So Steven, thank you very, very much for your presence here. It's very important to us to have this close touch with you guys. And we have a very big community here. We are still reuniting some strangers and some folks here that would like to organize a conference here in Brazil, some NG Brazil conference, NG Angular conference. And maybe you can come here to give a keynote here personally.
I would love to do that. It'll all depend on the timing. So I have a 3-month-old boy now. So not this month.
So thank you very much, Steven.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night.